Eleanor Ashford's hand was bleeding before anyone noticed. She had pressed it against the broken latch of the old garden gate at the edge of her family's property, trying to force it open the way she always did, and the rusted iron had bitten into her palm without warning. She did not cry. She was 7 years old, and she had decided the previous spring that crying was a waste of perfectly good time. She wrapped the hem of her pinafore around her hand, pushed the gate open with her shoulder, and stepped through into the wild patch of land that separated her family's garden from the Harrow estate next door. The oak tree was already visible from where she stood. It was enormous, older than anyone she had ever met, with roots that rose out of the ground like the backs of sleeping animals. She had been coming to this tree since she was 5 years old, and she had never once been told she was not allowed. The tree did not belong to either family in any way that mattered. It simply existed, the way old things do, as if it had been there long before the estates were built and intended to remain long after they were gone. Edmund Harrow was already sitting at the base of the tree. He was 8 years old and the son of the Earl of Dunmore, which meant very little to Eleanor, except that he had a horse named Captain and was allowed to stay up an hour later than she was. He was reading a book. He read books the way some boys climb trees, with total concentration and no awareness of the world around him. Eleanor had known him her whole life, in the way that neighboring children know each other, well enough to share silences, not always well enough to fill them. She sat down beside him, without asking permission. He did not look up. "Your hand is bleeding," he said, without looking up. "I know," she said. He turned a page. Then he set the book down, which meant he had noticed something he considered more important than his reading. He looked at her hand, wrapped in its strip of pinafore cotton, and said, "You should put it in the stream. Cold water stops bleeding." "I know that too," Eleanor said. "Then why haven't you?" "Because I wanted to sit down first." He considered this for a moment, as if it were a logical problem to be solved. Then he stood up, walked to the narrow stream that ran along the far edge of the tree's roots, and waited. Eleanor followed him, because it seemed like the reasonable thing to do, and she pressed her cut palm into the cold water, and held it there until the sharp sting softened into a dull ache. Edmund tore a strip from the inside hem of his own shirt without any dramatic gesture. He handed it to her. She bound her hand with it without thanking him, which was not rudeness but simply the way things worked between them. A thank you would have made the moment awkward and formal, and neither of them wanted that. They went back to the tree and sat down, and Edmund picked up his book again. "What are you reading?" Eleanor asked. "History of the Roman Empire." "Is it interesting?" "Very." She leaned her head against the tree bark and looked up through the canopy. The light came through in pieces, shifting and restless, the way summer light always does when the wind is moving. She thought about nothing in particular, which was the best kind of thinking. "Edmund," she said after a while. When we grow up," she said, in the straightforward way that children say things that adults would spend an hour preparing to say, "Will we still come to this tree?" He turned a page. "I expect so." "But you'll go away to school," she said. "Boys always go away to school." "I'll come back. You don't know that." He lowered his book and looked at her with the serious expression that was simply his natural face, not a performance. He had the kind of dark eyes that looked older than they were, and when he was thinking carefully about something they went very still. "I do know that," he said. "This is my home. I'll come back to it." Eleanor thought about this. She pulled a piece of long grass from the ground beside her and twisted it between her fingers. "My mother says girls grow up and get married and go to live somewhere else," she said. "She says that is the natural order of things." Edmund looked at her for another moment. Then, with the quiet certainty of someone solving a problem that was not actually all that complicated, he said, "Then marry me. You won't have to go somewhere else." Eleanor stopped twisting the grass. She looked at him. He looked back. Neither of them was embarrassed, because neither of them was old enough to understand that this was the kind of thing one was supposed to be embarrassed about. "All right," she said. "I accept." He picked up his book. She went back to looking at the light through the leaves. The stream moved quietly over its stones. Somewhere across the Ashford garden, Eleanor's governess was calling her name, not yet urgently. The world around them went on exactly as before, completely unaware that a promise had just been made beneath the branches of a very old oak tree. A promise made with a strip of torn shirt and a piece of twisted grass, and all the simple, absolute sincerity that only children are brave enough to offer. In the weeks that followed, the two of them continued to meet at the tree in the way that had become natural over the previous 2 years. Edmund brought his books. Eleanor brought whatever she happened to be thinking about that day, which was usually a great deal. She asked him questions about the Roman Empire. He answered them with care. She argued with his answers when she disagreed, and he did not become irritated the way her older brother did, but instead engaged with the argument seriously, as if her opinion had the same weight as anyone else's. Her governess, Miss Pringle, was a woman of 40 who had given up on surprising the world and now simply navigated it with quiet efficiency. She knew about the meetings at the oak tree. She did not think much of them. Children of neighboring estates played together. That was normal. What was slightly less normal was the quality of Eleanor's friendship with the Harrow boy, which was not the loud, careless friendship of children running through fields, but something quieter and more settled, like the friendship of two people who have known each other for much longer than they actually have. The Earl of Dunmore, Edmund's father, was a tall, handsome man who laughed too loudly at his own jokes and was considered charming by everyone who did not have to live with him. He came to the oak tree once that summer, following Edmund for reasons that were unclear, and found both children sitting there with books. He looked at Eleanor Ashford with the kind of benign indifference that adults give to children who are not their own, and then he laughed and said to his son, "Quite the bookworm you've found yourself here, haven't you?" Edmund said nothing. Eleanor looked at the Earl with clear, level eyes and said, "I enjoy reading, sir." The Earl laughed again and walked away. Edmund watched him go with an expression Eleanor could not read. She did not ask about it. Some things, she had already learned, were better left as silences. The summer moved through July and into August, with the particular slowness that summer has when you are young, and the days feel like they will stretch forever. Eleanor turned 8 in August. Edmund had already turned 9 by then, which meant he was a full year ahead of her now, a fact he did not mention and she did not acknowledge. Her birthday was marked by a small party at Ashford House. Her parents, her brother George, her aunt from Bristol, and 3 girls from the village whose company she did not especially enjoy, but tolerated for the sake of her mother's happiness. Edmund did not come to the party. He sent a note instead, written in his careful, slightly too formal handwriting. "Many happy returns of the day. I have left a gift at the gate." The gift was a small leather-bound journal with blank pages, which he had clearly chosen himself, and not with any adult's guidance, because it was exactly right. Eleanor pressed it to her chest briefly, which was the closest she came that year to showing anyone how much something meant to her. It was her brother George who first thought the whole arrangement was funny. George was 14, and at the age when finding things funny about younger siblings was one of his primary occupations. He had heard about the oak tree meetings and the note and the gift, and one evening at supper he said, loudly, "I hear Eleanor is going to marry the Harrow boy," in the tone of someone delivering a joke to an audience. Eleanor's father looked up from his soup with mild interest. Her mother set down her spoon. Eleanor said nothing. Her father said, "Oh?" George, enjoying himself enormously, continued. "She told him she accepts. It's very official. They might as well post the banns." Eleanor's mother looked across the table at Eleanor with an expression that was trying to be severe and not quite managing it. "Eleanor, did you and young Edmund discuss?" he asked. Eleanor said. "I said yes." We shook hands. She picked up her spoon and continued eating her soup with perfect composure. The Roman generals always shook hands to seal important agreements. There was a moment of silence at the table. Then Eleanor's father made a sound that he quickly turned into a cough, but which was clearly a suppressed laugh. Her mother pressed her lips together, in a way that was trying very hard not to be a smile. George looked faintly deflated that his joke had not produced the reaction he wanted. That night, lying in bed and listening to the sounds of the house settling around her, Eleanor thought about the conversation. She thought about it the way she thought about most things, carefully, from several angles, considering what it meant. She did not think the promise was funny. She was not embarrassed by it. She had made the promise in the full knowledge of what a promise meant, because she was a person who did not say things she did not mean. She simply felt, with the clear and uncomplicated certainty of a child who had not yet learned to doubt herself, that it was real. The autumn came, and with it a change in the air at the Harrow estate that Eleanor felt before she understood. The Earl of Dunmore was at home less often. Edmund mentioned this once, briefly, in the way he mentioned things he did not want to discuss at length. A single sentence, and then silence, and a return to whatever they had been talking about before. The Earl was in London, Edmund said. Business. Eleanor nodded and did not pursue it. The leaves turned gold, and then brown, and then fell, and the oak tree stood bare and enormous against the November sky, and Eleanor and Edmund continued to meet there, bundled now in coats and scarves, their breath making small clouds in the cold air. It was different in winter. The tree, starker and more honest, stripped of its summer abundance. Eleanor thought she liked it better this way. There was nothing hidden about it. One morning in November, Edmund arrived at the tree looking different. Not different in any visible way. He was wearing the same coat, the same serious expression, but different in the way a room feels different after a window has been opened and then closed again. Something had moved through him and left. She did not ask immediately. She sat down. She waited. This was one of the things she had learned about Edmund. He would tell you things when he was ready, and pressing him before that moment was like pressing on a bruise. It only made things worse. They sat in silence for a long time, long enough for a crow to land in the upper branches, consider them both with its sharp black eye, and fly away again. Then Edmund said, "My father lost a great deal of money." Eleanor looked at him. "How much?" "A great deal," he said again, which meant he did not know the exact number, but knew it was the kind of number that changed things. She thought about this. "Will you have to move?" "No," he said. "The estate is entailed." A pause. "But other things will change. I don't know what yet." She nodded. She looked at the bare branches above them. "Whatever changes," she said quietly, with the matter-of-fact certainty that was already characteristic of her, even at 8 years old. "This tree will still be here." Edmund looked at her. Something shifted briefly in his expression. Something that was not quite sadness, and not quite gratitude, but lived somewhere between the two. "Yes," he said. "It will." They did not speak of it again that day. But Eleanor thought about it for the rest of the walk home, and when she arrived at Ashford House, she found her mother in the sitting room, and sat down beside her, and leaned against her arm, without saying anything, which was not something Eleanor typically did. Her mother looked at her and seemed to understand, in the way mothers sometimes understand things without being told them, and put her arm around her daughter and said nothing at all. Christmas came. The Ashford family exchanged gifts and attended church and received neighbors for dinner. The Harrow estate was quiet. The Earl was visible occasionally, coming and going from the property in carriages, always moving too fast, and never stopping to exchange greetings with anyone. Edmund sent Eleanor a book for Christmas, a collection of Greek myths, with a note that said only, "In case the Romans become dull." She wrote back to say that the Romans would never become dull, but she was glad of the Greeks too. January was cold and wet, and the oak tree became inaccessible for several weeks because of flooding in the low field that led to it. Eleanor stood at the window of the upstairs hall sometimes and looked across the estate boundary toward where she knew the tree was standing, invisible behind the gray curtain of rain, and thought that patience was an underrated quality that nobody praised nearly enough. When February came and the ground dried enough to walk again, she went back to the tree and found Edmund already there. He was thinner. His coat was the same one from autumn, but something about how he wore it had changed. He was sitting very still and looking at the ground rather than reading, which was unusual for him. She sat down. She took out the Greek mythology book and opened it to a page she had already read 3 times. "I've been waiting," she said, not accusingly, but simply as a statement of fact. "I know," he said. "I've been—" He stopped. He looked at the stream. He said, "My father is not well." She closed the book. "Ill?" "Not in the way you mean," he said carefully, and she understood, because she was 8 years old and a careful observer of the world, that what he meant was something more complicated than a fever. She said, "I'm sorry, Edmund." He did not answer, but he shifted slightly, just barely, so that his shoulder was closer to hers. They sat that way for the rest of the afternoon, not saying very much, while the February light went gray, and the first cold stars appeared above the bare branches of the oak tree. That spring the Earl of Dunmore died. He died in London, in circumstances that were described in the newspaper, in careful, vague language, that meant something had happened, which the paper did not want to say plainly. Eleanor's father folded the paper and set it down, and said nothing. Her mother said, quietly, "Those poor children." Though Edmund was the Earl's only child, her brother George, for once, said nothing at all. Edmund was 12 years old, and suddenly, by the peculiar mathematics of inherited titles, the Earl of Dunmore, in name, if not yet in the full practical sense of the word. Eleanor heard this from her governess, and then confirmed it, when she went to the oak tree, 3 days after the news, and found Edmund already there, standing, rather than sitting, looking out at the stream. He turned when he heard her footsteps. His face was the same, his eyes were the same, but something had settled into him, like a stone sinking to the bottom of clear water, something heavy and permanent, and not necessarily wrong, just there. She stood across from him. She did not offer condolences the way adults did, with the careful, practiced phrases that meant well and felt hollow. She said, "What happens now?" He looked at her steadily. "I go to school in Edinburgh. My mother's cousin has arranged it. A military academy." Her stomach went cold. "When?" 3 weeks. She held very still. Around them, the spring birds were doing their business in the hedgerows, the stream was running bright with snowmelt, and the oak tree above them was just beginning to show the first pale green of new leaves. The world was not paying any attention to what was being lost. "You said you'd come back," she said. "I will come back," he said. "I promise you." She looked at him for a long time. He looked back. And because they were children, and because they had never learned to say less than they meant to each other, she said, "You also promised to marry me." He did not look away. He did not laugh. He said, "I know. That's 2 promises," she said. "Yes," he said. "It is." She nodded once, firmly, the way she nodded when she had made up her mind about something. Then she sat down at the base of the tree and took out her book, and after a moment, he sat down beside her, and they stayed there until the light failed and their respective households began to call for them across the evening fields. 3 weeks later, she stood at the end of the Ashford Lane and watched his carriage go. He did not look out the window. She would not have expected him to. That was not how either of them worked, but she watched until the carriage turned the corner and disappeared behind the elm trees, and then she stood there a moment longer in the silence it left, and then she turned and walked home. She was 8 years old. He was 12. The oak tree stood at the border of their estates, alone now, keeping its silence, with the patience of something that had been standing long before either of them was born, and would be standing long after both of them were gone. She did not cry. She had decided the previous year that crying was a waste of time. But she walked back to the house very slowly, and she went directly to her room, and she sat on her bed and held the leather-bound journal he had given her for her birthday, the one with the blank pages, and she stayed there for a very long time before she finally opened it and picked up her pen and began to write. The years that followed Eleanor Ashford's 8th birthday moved in the way that years do when you are waiting for something without quite admitting to yourself that you are waiting. They moved in seasons and lessons and the particular rhythm of a life that was comfortable without being easy, ordered without being simple. She grew, she learned, she became, gradually and without making any particular effort about it, someone that people noticed when she walked into a room. She was not beautiful in the easy, obvious way that some girls were, the kind of beauty that announces itself immediately and requires no second look. Hers was the kind that came into focus slowly, the kind that made a person look twice and then a third time, not because they had missed something the first time, but because there was simply more there than a single glance could hold. She had her mother's dark hair and her father's steady gray eyes, and she carried herself with a quietness that most people mistook for reserve, until they tried to have a genuine conversation with her, and found that she was, in fact, the most direct person they had ever spoken to. The governess Miss Pringle retired when Eleanor was 11, and was replaced by a younger woman named Miss Carrow, who was nervous and well-meaning, and slightly afraid of her pupil's intelligence. Eleanor was not unkind to her. She simply did not slow herself down to accommodate the nervousness, and after a few months, Miss Carrow stopped being nervous and simply accepted that this particular student was not the kind who needed to be led anywhere. She only needed someone to hold the door open. George went to Oxford when Eleanor was 10, which made the house quieter and more peaceful, and only slightly lonely. Her father spent long hours in his study, with his maps and his books of local history. Her mother managed the household with the quiet competence of a woman who had never been given credit for how much she was holding together. Eleanor watched her mother more carefully as she grew older, noting the small negotiations and invisible efforts that kept their family's life running smoothly, and felt a growing appreciation for a kind of skill that the world did not have the language to adequately name. She had not heard from Edmund in the first year after his departure. This did not surprise her. He was at a military academy in Edinburgh, with demanding masters and strict schedules, and she was 8 years old in the English countryside. The circumstances of their communication were not favorable. She wrote to him twice, formally, because she had decided that a promise warranted at least this much effort, and received no reply. She chose to believe this was because the school did not forward letters promptly, which may or may not have been true, and she did not adjust the weight she gave the promise based on his silence. The second year, a letter came. It arrived in October, addressed in Edmund's recognizable handwriting, careful and slightly too formal, to Miss Eleanor Ashford of Ashford House. Her mother handed it to her at breakfast without comment, though Eleanor noticed the particular quality of her mother's stillness that indicated she had noticed something and was choosing not to say it. Eleanor took the letter to her room to read. It was 3 paragraphs long. The first paragraph described Edinburgh with the precision of someone who was finding something difficult and was managing it by observing it very carefully. The second paragraph described his studies and the fact that mathematics, which he had previously found straightforward, had become considerably more complicated. The third paragraph said, "I trust you are well. I think of the tree sometimes. I hope you are visiting it, on behalf of both of us." That was all. He did not mention the promise. He did not need to. The letter itself was the acknowledgement. She wrote back. 4 paragraphs. The tree in October, her new governess, her brother George's departure for Oxford, and a question about whether Roman military strategy was similar to what they were being taught in Edinburgh. She signed it with her full name and posted it without rereading it, because she had found that rereading letters before sending them only introduced doubt where there had been perfectly good clarity. He wrote back within a month. Then she wrote. Then he wrote. This continued with something approaching regularity over the following years, a correspondence that was, on the surface, entirely proper. 2 children of neighboring families exchanging news and observations, and was, in some deeper sense that neither of them put into words, something much more deliberate than that. They were keeping a connection alive across distance and time, tending it the way you tend a fire when there is no more wood coming, and you need what you have to last the night. The letters were never romantic, in the conventional sense of that word. They did not say "I miss you," or "I think of you," or "I cannot wait to see you again." What they were was genuine. Edmund wrote about ideas he was working through, things he had read, observations about the other students at the academy, with a dry, precise humor that made Eleanor laugh out loud alone in her room. She wrote back with opinions, arguments, and the occasional piece of information about the oak tree, which she visited every week, and which she described with the care of a person filing a report for an absent colleague. She was 12 when she noticed that the other girls her age had begun to talk about the boys at the local assemblies in a way that was new and slightly bewildering. They talked about them with a giddy seriousness, ranking and comparing and speculating in a language that Eleanor could understand on the surface, but found herself disconnected from at some fundamental level. She participated when it was polite to do so. She found she had almost nothing to contribute. It was not that she did not understand the feeling they were describing. She simply found, when she examined herself honestly, that the feeling itself seemed to be already occupied. There was no space in her for that particular giddiness, because the space where it would have lived was already inhabited by something quieter and older and considerably more stubborn. She was 14 when the news came about the distant cousin. The Earl of Dunmore's estate had passed out of the Harrow family's immediate control after the debt scandal, held in a kind of suspended state while its various creditors and trustees negotiated. Then a cousin died, someone in a northern branch of the family that Eleanor had never heard of, and through a chain of inheritance so complicated that even her father could not follow it without the help of a solicitor. Edmund Harrow found himself at the age of 15, not merely the Earl of Dunmore in name, but the Duke of Dunmore in title. She heard this from her father, who heard it from the solicitor, who had handled paperwork for both estates for years. Her father told her at dinner, with a kind of careful neutrality, watching her face the way parents watch faces when they are trying to determine how information is landing. Eleanor absorbed the information. She set down her fork. She said, "Is the estate still in debt?" Her father nodded. "Considerably, yes." She picked up her fork again. "He'll manage it," she said, and went back to eating. Her father looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at his plate. He said nothing, which was his way of agreeing. She was 15 when Edmund came home for the first time since he had left. She was at the oak tree, not because she had known he was coming, but because she went there every week, and this happened to be the week he returned. She was sitting with her back against the bark, reading, when she heard footsteps on the other side of the stream. She looked up. He was tall. That was the first thing she noticed, because she had not expected it even though she had known, in an abstract sense, that boys grew. He was taller than her father. His face was the same dark eyes, the same serious expression, but it sat differently now, in the face of someone who had been making real decisions in a real world for 3 years. He looked, she thought with a peculiar clarity, like a person who had earned himself. They looked at each other for what was probably only 3 or 4 seconds, but felt like the amount of time you need to update a very long list. "You're taller," she said. "You're taller too," he said. She looked back at her book. "Come and sit down." He crossed the stream at the stepping stones and sat down beside her, not close, but close enough. The oak tree rose above them, enormous and unhurried, and the stream moved over its stones, and for a few minutes neither of them said anything, which was comfortable in a way that 3 years of distance had not damaged at all. "How is Edinburgh?" she said. "Cold," he said. "Behind me now. I've left." She looked up. "Left?" "I've learned what they can teach me," he said. "The rest I'll manage myself." He looked at the stream. "The estate needs attention. I need to be here to give it." She nodded. "The Northfield has been letting water badly," she said. "I've walked past it. The drainage wants fixing before the autumn rains." He turned to look at her with an expression that was starting to become a smile, but had not quite arrived there yet. "You've been watching my estate." "I've been watching the field," she said. "It's adjacent to ours. The flooding would affect both properties." The almost smile resolved itself. "Of course," he said. They stayed at the tree until the light began to fail, and they talked about the estate and the fields and the state of the local roads, and also about the Roman Empire and Greek philosophy and a book on natural history that Edmund had been reading on the journey south. And by the time they stood up to go home, Eleanor felt that 3 years had shrunk to a manageable distance, something that had been passed through rather than lost. He was at the tree the following week, and the week after that. The correspondence did not stop but transformed, folding itself into conversation. She found she preferred this. Letters were good for thoughts that needed time to form. Conversations were better for the things that became clear only in the speaking of them. She was 16 when she had her first season, which was not her full debut, but a preliminary introduction to the London social world under her aunt's guidance. She found it noisy and crowded, and considerably less interesting than she had expected, which was saying something, because she had not expected it to be very interesting at all. The assemblies were pleasant enough. The conversation at them was largely not. She danced when asked, she smiled when appropriate, and she came home with the conviction that she had not encountered a single person who interested her as much as the person she had been talking to 2 weeks ago at an oak tree in her own county. She did not say this to Edmund. She did not need to. They did not speak in that language. Edmund, meanwhile, was doing something quiet and enormous. He was untangling his father's debts. The full scale of what the old earl had left behind was not publicly known, but Eleanor knew from her father that it was significant. The kind of debt that takes a decade of careful management to address, if you are lucky and disciplined and very, very good at knowing what to give up first. Edmund was all 3 of those things. He sold 2 properties in the north that were attached to no entailment and carried heavy maintenance costs. He renegotiated terms with 3 separate creditors in the same month and came away from all 3 meetings having paid less than any of them had intended to accept. He planted the south fields with crops that were more profitable than picturesque. He managed his household with a strictness that was not ungenerous, but was absolutely unapologetic. Eleanor watched all of this from the neighboring estate with a particular quality of attention that she did not quite analyze, but which was, if she had been asked, something very close to admiration. She was 17 when she went to London for a proper season. Her mother had arranged it carefully, and Eleanor had cooperated without enthusiasm and then found, to her mild surprise, that it was not entirely without interest. Not because of the assemblies, those remained noisy and crowded, but because London itself was interesting, full of ideas and arguments and libraries, and people who thought seriously about things. She spent more time than was strictly fashionable, in bookshops, and in the company of her aunt's more intellectually inclined friends. She danced when she had to, and excused herself from conversations that were not worth the time. Several gentlemen expressed admiration. She was polite to all of them, and accepted no particular attention from any of them, which her mother noted with a mixture of exasperation and reluctant understanding. Her mother had the sense not to press. She simply made sure Eleanor attended the events, and left the rest to whatever Eleanor intended, which was, apparently, nothing in particular. She came back from London in June, thinner from the pace of it, and glad to be home. She went to the oak tree on the second day back. Edmund was there. He looked at her with the still, careful attention that was simply how he looked at things he was thinking seriously about. "How was London?" he said. "Loud," she said. "Did you enjoy it?" She considered the question honestly. "Some of it," she said. "The bookshops mostly." He nodded, as if this was the answer he had expected, which she supposed it was. They stayed at the tree for 2 hours and then walked back to their respective houses in the warm June evening, and Eleanor felt, with the clarity that sometimes comes at the end of things, rather than the beginning, that she was precisely where she was supposed to be. She was 18, then 19, then 20. Her second season in London produced no different result from the first, and her third was shaping up the same way. Her mother had largely stopped mentioning it with urgency. Eleanor had become, through the combined force of her own composure and the world's gradual acceptance of it, a person whose choices were not questioned very much, because they were made with such evident conviction. Edmund had cleared the second of his father's major debts by the time Eleanor was 21. She knew this because he told her, at the oak tree, on a gray September afternoon, as if it were an item checked off a list. He said it without triumph, which she respected. He said it the way a person says something that cost them a great deal but was the right price. She looked at him. He had lines at the corners of his eyes now that had not been there when he was 15 and came home the first time. He was still the same person. The serious face, the dark eyes, the quiet precision with which he did everything. But time had put its marks on him the way it does, not diminishing, but deepening. She thought about a grass ring woven beside a stream. She thought about a strip of shirt wrapped around a cut hand. She thought about a promise made with a handshake under a very old tree, by two children who did not yet know enough to understand that promises are easy to make and hard to keep, and who kept it anyway, without drama, year after year, through absence and silence, and the complicated ordinary weight of living. She did not say any of this. She simply nodded, and said, "One more left?" "One more," he said. "Then you'll be free of it." He looked at her for a moment with the expression she had never quite been able to read, the one that lived somewhere between the face he showed the world and the one he kept for himself. "Yes," he said quietly, "I expect I will." She looked back at the stream. The September light was low and golden and making the water shine, and the oak tree's leaves were just beginning to turn, and somewhere inside her chest there was a feeling she had been carrying for over a decade, like a stone in a pocket. Not heavy enough to weigh her down, but always present, always there, always waiting for the moment when she would finally pull it out and look at it directly. She was not ready to do that yet, but she was getting there. The Countess of Whitmore was the kind of woman who had a talent for making necessary things look accidental. She could arrange a seating plan with the precision of a general deploying troops, and by the end of an evening, everyone at the table would be convinced that they had simply happened to end up beside the right person, that it had been luck and not architecture. Those who knew her well were aware of this quality and admired it. Those who did not know her well simply felt, vaguely, that they always seemed to have a good time at her table without quite understanding why. Eleanor Ashford knew the Countess well enough to be wary of her, which was why she had tried, not very hard and not very convincingly, to avoid the autumn estate party at Whitmore Hall. She had told her mother that she was not feeling entirely herself, Her mother had looked at her with the particular expression of a woman who has lived with her daughter for 22 years and said, "You look perfectly fine to me," and that had been the end of the discussion. So Eleanor arrived at Whitmore Hall on the first Friday of October, with her trunk, her good manners, and the private conviction that this party would be exactly like every other party she had attended in the past 4 years. Pleasant, forgettable, and a complete waste of a weekend that she could have spent at home, with a book, and the reliable company of her own thoughts. She had been at Whitmore Hall for less than 3 hours when she walked into the drawing room before supper and found that she was wrong. She was halfway through a genuinely dull conversation about the pheasant season with a man named Lord Aldgate, who had been hunting for 40 years and had the passionate certainty of a person who has never had a competing interest, when the drawing room door opened and she glanced across, not because she expected anything, but because doors opening in rooms is the kind of thing the eye moves toward automatically, and saw Edmund Harrow standing just inside the threshold. He was taller than she remembered, which was not possible, because she had seen him 2 weeks ago at the estate, and in any case, she remembered his height very accurately. What she meant was that he was taller than she had been carrying him in her mind, in the context of parties, and drawing rooms, and the world beyond the oak tree, where she had always pictured him smaller than the space around him. He was not smaller than the space around him. He was, in fact, the kind of presence that made the space around him organize itself slightly differently. He held a glass of wine. He was wearing a coat that had clearly been made by someone who understood what they were doing. He looked, in the assembled company of Whitmore Hall's autumn guests, like a man who had arrived from a different version of the world and was deciding how much effort to put into translating. Then he looked across the room and found her face among the faces, and something in his expression shifted. Not dramatically, not in a way that anyone watching would have caught, but she was not watching in the way anyone else was watching. She caught it. He gave a small, careful bow. She gave a smaller, more careful curtsy. Lord Aldgate continued talking about pheasants. Eleanor excused herself a moment later, with a politeness that Lord Aldgate appeared not to notice, because he continued talking for several seconds after she had turned away. Supper that evening was 30 people around the Countess's long table, with candles and silver, and the warmth of a room that had been gathering heat all day. The Countess had arranged the seating with her customary precision, and Eleanor found herself placed at the far end of the table, in what appeared to be a quiet corner. Edmund was placed beside her. Eleanor looked at the Countess briefly, across the length of the table. The Countess looked back with an expression of absolute and serene innocence. Eleanor looked away. The supper was good, and the conversation at the busy center of the table was loud enough that the far end of it settled into smaller, quieter exchanges. Lord Fenton, a jovial man of 50 who was sitting near enough to be within earshot, was in the process of working through his favorite topic, which was the matrimonial prospects of everyone he considered interesting, and was doing so with the cheerful obliviousness of someone who has never noticed that other people find this topic less entertaining than he does. He had been going around the table for the past quarter hour, and now he turned his attention to Edmund with the air of a man who has saved the best for last. "Come now, Dunmore," he said, loud enough for 6 or 7 people to hear. "Who is it to be? The whole of England's been waiting these past 5 years. Surely there's a lady somewhere in this great nation who has managed to interest you." There was a ripple of gentle laughter around that end of the table. People leaned in slightly without meaning to, the way people always do when they suspect they might be about to witness something worth repeating. Edmund set down his wineglass. He did not rush. He did not look flustered, which was not something Edmund Harrow generally looked, regardless of the circumstances. He looked, for just a fraction of a second, at Eleanor beside him, and then he said, pleasantly, and with no particular emphasis, "I believe I made my selection some years ago." The laughter that followed was warm and general, and took the comment exactly as everyone intended it to be taken, as the kind of charming, deflecting wit that a duke produces in social situations to avoid giving actual information while appearing to be perfectly forthcoming. Eleanor's hand, holding her water glass, went very still. She set the glass down with complete control. She looked at her plate. Around her, the conversation had moved on already, skipping forward to the next topic the way dinner conversation does, and no one was paying attention to the far end of the table anymore, and Lord Fenton had already turned his considerable enthusiasm toward someone else. She was aware of Edmund beside her, She was aware of him in the precise way that you are aware of something that has been part of your world for so long that your senses have developed a specific register just for it. She did not plan what she said next. It was not a plan. It was the thing that was simply true, rising up the way true things do, when you have been holding them carefully for long enough that holding them becomes more effort than saying them. She said it quietly, so that only he could hear. She said it without looking at him, looking instead at the table in front of her, at her hands, at the flickering candle that was making small shadows move across the cloth. She said, "I still would, you know." The silence that followed was not the silence of an empty room. It was the silence of a room that had not noticed anything had happened, continuing on around them, while between the two people at the far end of the table, something very old and very patient finally moved. She made herself look at him. The expression on Edmund's face was not the expression of a man who had just been teased. It was not amused, or surprised in the easy way, or deflecting. It was something she had never seen on his face in the entire time she had known him, which was her entire life. It was, she recognized with a peculiar steadiness, the face of a man who had just heard the thing he had been waiting to hear, and did not know what to do with the fact that it had arrived. He looked at her. She looked back. The candle between them wavered in some draft from the window, and the conversation at the rest of the table rolled on like a river that doesn't know there are two people sitting very still on its bank. She should not have said it. That was the practical thought, arriving a few seconds after the word, the way practical thoughts always arrive, correct, sensible, and too late to be useful. She was a lady of 22 at a dinner party, not a child at an oak tree. There were rules about what one said, and to whom, and under what circumstances, and she had just ignored all of them in favor of 7 words that she could not take back. But she found, sitting there with the warmth of the room around her, and Edmund Harrow looking at her, with that expression she had never seen before, that she did not especially want to take them back. She had said the true thing. Whatever happened next, she had said the true thing, and it was already out in the world where it could not be unmade. She turned back to her plate. She picked up her fork. She ate the rest of the meal with the steady composure that was simply who she was, and she did not look at Edmund again for the remainder of supper. And the Countess at the far end of the table watched them both with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who has arranged things correctly and is waiting to see them play out. After supper, the gentlemen went to one room, and the ladies went to another, which was the custom, and Eleanor spent an hour in the ladies' sitting room, discussing the merits of various dress fabrics, with 3 women she liked reasonably well, and a 4th she did not know at all. She was composed. She was present. She smiled at the right moments, and contributed to the conversation, and no one in the room would have guessed that she was also, in some deep and separate part of herself, sitting very still, in the middle of a silence she did not know how to interpret. She went to bed at 11. She lay in the comfortable guest room of Whitmore Hall, and looked at the ceiling, and told herself, clearly and directly, the way she dealt with all things, the full truth of her situation. She had said something that could not be unsaid. She did not know what Edmund had done with it. She would not know until something happened to tell her, and something might not happen at all, because a man who has spent 15 years constructing his life in a particular careful way does not necessarily rearrange it because of 7 words spoken quietly over a dinner table. She closed her eyes. She breathed steadily. She slept. The following morning she came down to breakfast at 8 o'clock to find the dining room already well populated with Whitmore Hall guests in various states of morning alertness. The Countess was at the head of the table, looking entirely awake and very pleased with the world. Several guests were discussing a planned walk to the lake. Several more were discussing the weather. Lord Fenton was discussing himself. Edmund was not at the table. Eleanor served herself from the sideboard and sat down and drank her tea, and told herself that his absence meant nothing. He might be up early, walking. He might be a late riser. She had known him all her life, and did not actually know whether he was a morning person. There were areas of his life she had never seen. The thought was odd, that you could know someone for 15 years, and still not know whether they preferred early mornings or late ones. He appeared at 9:15, took tea and toast, and sat at the opposite end of the table from her. He did not look at her for the first 10 minutes, and she did not look at him, because she was not someone who watched people to see if they would look at her. She had more dignity than that. But at some point before 11, she was not monitoring the time. She found herself on the terrace with a cup of tea, looking out over the Whitmore grounds in the pale October sunshine, and she was aware, with the particular awareness she had developed for this specific person over a long lifetime of proximity, that he had come to stand near her. Not beside her, near her, close enough to be a conversation, far enough to be deniable. She looked out at the garden. He looked out at the garden. A gardener was raking leaves in the distance with the methodical patience of someone who has been doing this for many years and expects to be doing it for many more. "It was a good dinner," Edmund said. "Yes," she said. A pause. The gardener raked. A wood pigeon did something in the nearby hedge. "You said something," Edmund said. "At supper." "Yes," she said. "I would like to." He stopped. This was unusual. Edmund Harrow did not typically stop in the middle of sentences. He was a person who knew what he was going to say before he said it. The stopping was information. She waited. She was good at waiting. "I was not joking," he said. She turned to look at him. He was still looking at the garden, at the gardener, and the leaves, and the pale October sky above the formal hedges. His profile was the same as it had always been, precise, unreadable, steady. But his jaw was set in a particular way that meant he was working at the steadiness, that it was not coming automatically this morning. "Lord Fenton asked you a question," she said carefully, "and you gave an amusing answer." "Yes," he said, "but the answer was not untrue." She looked at him for a long moment. He turned then to look back at her, and they regarded each other in the cool October light, and she felt the weight of 15 years sitting in the air between them, like something visible, like weather. "I see," she said. "Do you?" he said. She looked back at the garden. The gardener had moved to the far end of the lawn. The wood pigeon emerged from the hedge, considered the terrace, and decided against it. "I said what I said last night," she said quietly, "because it was true. Not because I expected anything from it. Not because I was making a claim. I said it because—" She stopped and found the right words, and said them. "Because I have been honest with you since I was 8 years old, and I saw no reason to stop." When she looked at him again, he was looking at her with an expression that was no longer the unreadable one. It was something she had not seen before, or had seen, she thought, only once. On a cold February day at an oak tree, when he had told her about his father. And for just a moment, in the middle of all that steadiness, something real and unguarded had shone through. "Eleanor," he said, and her name in his voice at that moment sounded different from the way he usually said it. Not more formal, but more careful. The way you say something you have been thinking about for a long time, and want to get exactly right. "Yes," she said. "I have something to tell you," he said, and then he stopped, because the Countess's voice called across the terrace from the open drawing-room door, bright and entirely unapologetic. "Lady Eleanor Dunmore, will you join us for the lake walk? We're assembling in the hall." Eleanor looked at Edmund. Edmund looked at Eleanor. The moment stretched and then folded back into the morning, tucking itself away. "Yes," Edmund called back, without looking away from her. "We'll be there directly." He looked at her a moment longer. "Later," he said quietly. Just the one word, but the weight behind it was the weight of someone who means to finish what they have started. She nodded once, then she turned and went inside to collect her coat for the lake walk, and he followed a moment later, and neither of them said anything else before joining the rest of the party in the hall. But as they walked down the terrace steps and across the Whitmore lawns toward the glittering distant lake, Eleanor kept her eyes forward and her expression steady. And inside her chest, the stone she had been carrying for 15 years shifted very slightly in its pocket, as if making room for something. The day did not cooperate with Edmund Harrow's stated intention. The lake walk turned into a group expedition, the kind that gathers momentum through the contributions of 12 different people, until it becomes something much larger and noisier than anyone originally envisioned. Lord Fenton led from the front. 3 of the younger guests raced to the water's edge. The Countess presided over the whole thing with the calm authority of a woman who has arranged many parties and knows that organized chaos is still fundamentally organized. Eleanor walked in the middle of the group with 2 women she found genuinely pleasant, and Edmund walked toward the back with a quiet, fair-haired man named Henry Clifton, who was apparently an old acquaintance from his school years. She could see him when she glanced back, which she did twice and then stopped doing. She was not someone who looked back repeatedly at things. She had established this as a personal rule some years ago, and saw no reason to abandon it on the grounds of a conversation that had not even technically happened yet. The lake was beautiful. It had the particular beauty of English landscapes in October: gray water, amber trees, a sky that couldn't decide between clouds and clearing. Several of the guests expressed admiration of it in the general way. Eleanor stood at the edge and looked at the light on the water and thought about nothing specific, which was becoming harder than it usually was. Henry Clifton appeared beside her. He was a pleasant man, with an easy manner, and the relaxed confidence of someone who has never had to work very hard at being liked. He had, she gathered from his conversation, known Edmund at Edinburgh and had maintained a friendship with him over the years, which said something good about him because Edmund was not a person who maintained friendships casually. He was selective and consistent and loyal, and the people he kept in his life tended to be worth keeping. "You've known Dunmore long?" Henry asked, in the light tone of someone who is genuinely curious, but is not making anything of it. "All my life," she said. "Our estates are adjacent." "Ah," he said, with a note of comprehension that suggested Edmund might have mentioned her at some point. She chose not to pursue this. "He's a remarkable man," Henry said. "I've known him for over 10 years, and I'm still not certain I fully understand him. But I trust him absolutely, which is not something I can say about many people." Eleanor looked at the water. "No," she said, "it isn't." Henry nodded pleasantly and moved on to talk to someone else, and Eleanor stood at the edge of the lake and let the wind off the water move through her hair, and thought that trust was, in fact, exactly the right word. Not the only word, but the right one, the foundation everything else was built on. She had trusted Edmund since she was 8 years old, with the uncomplicated certainty of someone who had simply found, without looking for it, a person she could be entirely herself with. And she still did. That had not shifted. The party began to make its way back toward Whitmore Hall at 2 o'clock, and by the time they arrived the afternoon light had softened, and tea was waiting in the drawing room, and the easy, unhurried pace of an estate party reasserted itself over the next few hours. Eleanor drank her tea. She listened to a long account from one of the ladies about a recent visit to Bath. She played 2 hands of cards with the Countess and won one of them. Edmund did not find her that afternoon. She did not find him. The house was full of people, and there was no natural opportunity for a private conversation, and she did not manufacture one, because she was not, under any circumstances, the kind of person who manufactured opportunities. Either things happened or they did not, and either way she maintained her composure. She was reading in the upstairs sitting room at 4 o'clock when there was a knock at the open door. Edmund stood in the doorway. He was not carrying anything. He was simply there, with his customary stillness, and behind him, the upstairs corridor of Whitmore Hall was empty, because everyone else was still in the drawing room below. "Now?" she said. "If you are not occupied," he said. She set down her book. "I was reading about botany," she said. "It will survive the interruption." He came into the room and sat down across from her, the upstairs sitting room being furnished with 2 chairs and a small table, with a cold lamp on it, which was slightly more intimate than a drawing room, but entirely proper in the way of incidental spaces in country houses. The window behind him showed the Whitmore grounds going golden in the late afternoon. "I have something to say to you," he said. "Yes," she said. "You said that this morning." "I know." He looked at her steadily. "I have thought about how to say it correctly for approximately 17 years, he said, "and I find that I have not become significantly more capable of it in that time. So I will simply say it." She folded her hands in her lap. She said nothing. The room was very quiet. "I have never not meant it," he said. "The promise. Since the day I made it, I have never not meant it. I want you to know that. Not because I expect it to mean anything in particular to you, but because I would prefer not to have continued not saying it for another 17 years. She looked at him. She looked at him for a long time, with the full, clear attention she brought to things that mattered. And she saw in his face what she had been seeing in fragments for years, in letters, in afternoons at the oak tree, in the careful way he said her name, in the February morning when he told her about his father, and let her see, briefly, the part of himself he kept from the world. She had been carrying the stone in her pocket for 15 years. She had always known it was there. She had simply never been entirely certain, until this moment, that he knew she was carrying it too. "Edmund," she said. He waited. "You are the least demonstrative person I have ever known," she said, and there was something almost like warmth in her voice, something close to the tone she used for things she found genuinely dear. "You have never, in all the years I have known you, said anything you did not mean. Everything you have ever told me has been true." "Yes," he said. "Then I already knew," she said quietly. "I think I have known for a long time. I was simply waiting for you to be ready to say it." The silence after this was not uncomfortable. It was the particular silence of something arriving that has been a long time on the road. Edmund looked at her with that expression, the one she had been cataloging for years, and she finally understood what it was. It was the face of a person who loves someone and has spent a very long time being careful about it, being responsible with it, not letting it become a pressure or a demand. It was the face of a person who has respected someone enough to give them room. "There is something else," he said. "Yes," she said. "You said you had something to tell me." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "There is a matter. A practical matter. I need to explain it to you before—" He stopped. He seemed to be determining the exact right order for what he was about to say, before anything else is said. She sat forward slightly. "Tell me," he told her. He told her in the measured, precise way that was his manner with difficult information, not sparing himself, not hedging, simply laying it out as clearly as he could. There was a debt still outstanding. His father's last debt. The largest one. The one he had been addressing for 12 years, and had still not quite reached the end of. There was a solution that had been arranged, not formally, but in the way certain things were arranged between men who used words like understood and settled. Miss Portia Langley, £40,000. A father in Parliament who had offered to resolve the remaining debt as a condition of a match. Edmund had not objected. He had not agreed formally, but he had not objected. He had intended, until a certain supper the previous evening, to proceed with the arrangement as the most sensible resolution to a problem he had been managing for over a decade. He told her all of this. He did not omit anything. He did not soften any part of it. When he was finished, the sitting room was very still. Eleanor looked at the window. The Whitmore grounds were fully golden now, the October afternoon doing its best work. She looked at the lamp on the table. She looked at her hands. She said, "Is Miss Langley aware of this arrangement?" "I believe her father has mentioned it to her," he said. "There has been no formal approach." "Then nothing has been promised," she said. "No," he said, "nothing formal." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, carefully, "Why are you telling me?" He looked at her. "Because you said something to me at dinner last night," he said. "And because I have just told you that I have never not meant the promise I made when I was 8 years old. And those two facts are in conflict with the arrangement I was proposing to enter. I thought you deserved to know." She nodded slowly. "And what do you intend to do about that conflict?" He said, "That is what I am still determining. I wanted to speak to you before I determined it." She looked at him for a long, serious moment. Then she said something that surprised him. She could see it in his face. She said, "The debt is yours to solve. You have been solving it for 12 years. You will solve the remainder without selling an arrangement you do not want to be in." He was very still. "I am not telling you what to do," she said. "I am telling you what I believe about your capability. You have managed everything else. You will manage this. And whatever you decide about the arrangement with Miss Langley's family, I want you to decide it based on what is right, and not on what I said at dinner." He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, very quietly, "Eleanor." "Yes," she said. "What you said at dinner," he said. "Did you mean it?" She met his eyes. "I have known you since I was 8 years old," she said. "I do not say things I do not mean. You know that." The afternoon light through the window was long and golden, and the sitting room was warm, and the house around them was full of ordinary party sounds, distant and harmless. And the two of them sat across from each other in the quiet of it, while something shifted, finally and irrevocably, into its correct place. "Give me a week," he said. "I am not going anywhere," she said. He nodded. He stood. He picked up his composure, which was never far from him even in moments like this, and wore it back into place with the practice of a long habit. He said, "Thank you for listening," she said. "I have been listening to you for 15 years. It is not a burden." He left the room. Eleanor sat in the chair for a few minutes after he had gone, looking at the window and the golden afternoon and the distant tree line of the Whitmore grounds. And she thought, with the clear and uncluttered quality of thought that comes when you are no longer uncertain about something you have been uncertain about for a very long time, that the world was quite a good place when it was honest. Then she picked up her botany book and continued reading. Eleanor Ashford left Whitmore Hall on Sunday morning. She had intended to stay through Monday, but when she woke on Sunday, she found that what she wanted, more than any further conversation or quiet afternoon in the Countess's sitting room, was the particular peace of her own house, her own room, and the oak tree. She told the Countess she was leaving at breakfast. The Countess accepted this with gracious serenity that suggested she had expected it and was not displeased by it. "You'll come back in December," the Countess said, which was not a question, but was not quite a command either. It was the tone of a woman who expects to be obliged, and generally is. Edmund was not at breakfast. Eleanor did not look for him. She had said what she had said, and he had said what he had said, and now the situation was what it was, and looking for him to add something to it would be a form of pressure she had no intention of applying. She was not a person who applied pressure. She was a person who waited and meant things, and trusted that others would mean things too, or would not, and that either way she would manage. She was in the entrance hall at 10 o'clock, waiting for her trunk to be brought down, when she heard footsteps behind her, and turned to find Edmund there. He was not carrying anything. He looked, she thought, like someone who had slept very little and was managing it with excellent posture. "You're leaving," he said. "Yes," she said. "I had not finished," he began. "You asked for a week," she said calmly. "I am giving you a week. Leaving does not prevent that." He looked at her. "I spoke with Langley's father yesterday evening," he said. She went very still. "I told him I could not proceed with the arrangement," he said. "The terms were generous, and I am grateful for the offer, and I have declined it." She kept her face composed. She kept everything composed, because she was Eleanor Ashford, and composure was not a mask she put on, but simply the surface of who she was. But underneath it, something that had been braced for a very long time, quietly let go. "Edmund," she said, "the debt. The remaining debt is mine to solve," he said. "As you pointed out yesterday, you were right. I have been carrying my father's choices long enough. I will finish them on my own terms." She looked at him steadily. "That will take longer." "Yes," he said, "it will take longer. And you have decided that is acceptable." "I have decided," he said, with the quiet certainty of a man who has been thinking very carefully for a very long time, that some things are not negotiable, and that I was treating them as if they were. The entrance hall of Whitmore Hall was not the oak tree. It was a formal room with a high ceiling and a tiled floor and the particular coldness of a large country house in October. There was a clock on the wall and a portrait of someone's grandfather above the fireplace, and somewhere upstairs, a door was opening and closing as other guests began their morning. None of this was the right setting for what was happening between them. Eleanor thought this with a fragment of her attention that was not occupied with the rest of it. "Will you come home soon?" she said. It was a simple question, but it was not a simple question. "Next week," he said. "I have business in London first, and then I will come home." She nodded. She said, "The oak tree could use attention. There is a branch on the east side that looks uncertain." He looked at her with that expression, the one she had named, finally, the previous afternoon. "I will look at it when I return," he said. The sound of her trunk on the stairs brought the practical world back into the room. Her maid appeared. A footman appeared. The Countess could be heard in the corridor beyond, directing someone about something. The morning had resumed its requirements. Eleanor turned to manage her departure. But before she did, she said, quietly and without making any particular moment of it, "Edmund, I meant what I said." He was looking at her with complete stillness. "I know," he said. "So did I." She went out to the carriage. She did not look back, because she never looked back, because that was a personal rule that she maintained, even when it cost her something. The carriage moved off down the Whitmore Drive, and the house and the grounds and the October morning gradually passed behind her, and Eleanor settled into the cushion and looked out the window at the English countryside moving past, and felt, for the first time in a very long time, as if the world was the right size. Her maid, a sensible young woman named Nell, who had been with her for 3 years and had learned to interpret Eleanor's silences, said nothing for the first 10 miles. Then she said, carefully, "The Duke looked very well, I thought." "Did he?" Eleanor said. "Very," Nell said, and went back to looking out her window, and did not say anything else for the rest of the journey. Eleanor arrived home at Ashford House in the early afternoon, to find her mother in the sitting room, and her father in his study, and the house in its usual state of comfortable order. Her mother looked up when she came in, and said, "You're early." "Yes," Eleanor said. Her mother looked at her. Not the polite surface look of a woman noting her daughter's arrival, but the deeper look, the one mothers develop over decades of careful observation. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Come and sit down." Eleanor sat. Her mother poured tea. They drank it in the particular quiet of a sitting room in the afternoon, with the fire going and the windows showing the gray October garden. "Something happened," her mother said. "Several things," Eleanor said. Her mother waited. Eleanor set down her cup, and then, because she was home, and the fire was warm, and her mother was the person who had watched her grow up with the most careful and accurate attention, she said, simply and entirely, "I think it is going to be all right." Her mother looked at her for a long moment, then she said, "Yes," as if she had known this for some time, and had simply been waiting for Eleanor to arrive at it. "I think so too." Eleanor went to the oak tree the next morning. It was a gray, cold Monday in October, the kind of morning that feels like the world is preparing for winter, and has sent the day out ahead of it as an advance notice. The leaves were mostly down now, brown and copper on the ground, and the tree stood bare and large and entirely itself, indifferent to the season, in the way of things that have been standing through seasons for a very long time. She sat at the base of it, her back against the bark, and she looked at the stream and the bare field and the gray sky, and she thought about a grass ring and a strip of torn shirt and a handshake. She thought about letters from Edinburgh. She thought about a sitting room at Whitmore Hall, and a man with dark eyes, and the expression she had finally, after all these years, managed to name. She sat there for a long time. The cold did not bother her. She had always liked the cold. It had a clarity to it, a honesty, that summer's warmth did not quite manage. When she stood up to go back to the house, she paused for a moment and put her hand flat against the bark of the oak tree, the way she sometimes did, the way she had been doing since she was small. The bark was rough and cold and absolutely solid under her palm. "Nearly," she said, to the tree, which was not something she did as a rule, but the occasion seemed to warrant it. The tree said nothing. Trees, in Eleanor Ashford's experience, were reliable, exactly because they said nothing, and changed nothing, and were simply there, which was the most useful thing in the world. She walked back to the house in the cold October morning, and she was entirely herself, and she had no doubt that things would work out exactly as they should. Eleanor had always believed that waiting was a form of respect, not passive waiting, not the waiting of someone who had given up and was simply enduring time, but active waiting, the kind that required you to continue fully inhabiting your own life, while something else resolved itself at the pace it required. It was, she had found, a quality that most people found difficult, and that she had developed, through necessity and practice, into something almost natural. The week after she returned from Whitmore Hall was exactly this kind of waiting. She managed it by managing everything else. She helped her mother plan the household accounts for November. She walked the estate with her father and gave her opinion on the drainage problem in the East Field, which had been dragging on for 2 seasons without resolution. She answered her brother George's letter, in which he described, at length and with great self-satisfaction, his recent social successes in London, and she replied with the kind of warm, dry affection she had always had for him, noting that he seemed to be thriving, and suggesting he might thrive even more if he occasionally read something written before the current decade. She visited the oak tree, she read her botany book, and then a book on the history of English common law, which she had borrowed from her father's library, and which was considerably more interesting than it sounded. She had tea with their nearest neighbor, a kind woman of 60, named Mrs. Dalton, who had opinions about everything, and shared them generously. She slept well. She ate well. She did not spend evenings staring at the fire wondering. This was not because she did not care what happened. She cared very much. But she had learned, through a long apprenticeship in caring about things she could not control, that caring and worrying were not the same activity, and that only one of them was useful. On the 8th day, a letter arrived. It was not from Edmund. It was from her mother's cousin in London, who wrote intermittently about the social news of the city, with the enthusiasm of someone who found it genuinely interesting, and who mentioned, in the second paragraph of a long letter about a recent musical performance, that she had heard from Lady Wentworth that the arrangement between the Duke of Dunmore and Miss Portia Langley's family had been quietly dissolved, the Duke having declined to proceed. Eleanor read this paragraph twice. Then she folded the letter and set it on the table beside her tea. She had known this already. Edmund had told her himself, but there was a particular quality to seeing it confirmed in writing, in the casual news of the city, that made it feel more real, made it feel like a door that had been standing ajar had now been properly closed, allowing the occupants of the room to arrange themselves according to a different floor plan. She went back to her botany book, but she found she was not reading it. She was simply looking at the page, while her mind did something quieter and more private, which was the work of beginning to believe, fully and without reservation, that the thing she had been certain of for a very long time was actually going to happen. It was on the 11th day, not the 7th as he had said, he had presumably been detained in London, that she heard the sound she had been not listening for. She was at the oak tree. The November morning was very cold, colder than October, and she was wearing her heaviest coat and a pair of her mother's old gloves, and she had with her the Greek mythology book that Edmund had given her for her 8th birthday, and which she still returned to periodically for the pleasure of it. She was rereading the story of Penelope, who had waited 20 years for a person to come home, and had in the meantime simply continued being entirely and competently herself, which Eleanor had always found the most admirable part of the story. She heard the footsteps from some distance. She recognized them before she looked up, which was not remarkable. She had been recognizing those footsteps for 15 years, and her ear had developed its own particular register for them. She closed the book and stood. Edmund came around the side of the hedgerow that bordered the field, and stopped when he saw her. He had been traveling, she could see. His coat had the slight dishevelment of a man who has come a long way, and came directly, rather than going to the house first. He looked tired in the way that people look when they have been doing something demanding for a sustained period, but he also looked, she thought, like someone who has put down something very heavy. He looked at her across the short distance between them. She looked back at him. "You went to the tree first," she said. "Yes," he said. "You could have gone to the house." "I could have," he agreed. "But I thought you might be here." "I usually am," she said. He crossed the field to where she was standing. Up close he was, as she had noted at Whitmore Hall, taller than the way she usually carried him in her mind, a fact she still found slightly startling even after all these years. He looked down at the book in her hand. "Penelope," he said. "Yes," she said. "I find her sensible." Something that was close to a smile moved briefly across his face. Then it settled back into seriousness, because Edmund did not stay in smiling territory for long, and because what he had to say was serious. "I sorted the London matter," he said. "I know," she said. "I heard. I have a plan for the remaining debt. It will take 4 years, perhaps 5, with careful management." He said this not apologetically, but precisely, as someone stating facts. "It is not a glamorous solution. It is simply the correct one." "Yes," she said. "I wanted you to know the full situation," he said, "before I said anything further. I did not want you to." He stopped. He chose the next words carefully, as he always did. But this time, the carefulness had a different quality. It was not the carefulness of avoiding something, but of reaching toward it. "I did not want anything I said to be an imposition on you. I am not offering ease. I am not offering simplicity. I am offering," another pause, then, "whatever I am able to offer, which is a dukedom with 4 years of careful management ahead of it, and a house that needs the north wing replastered, and a person who has meant a particular thing for a very long time." She looked at him. The November morning was very cold and very clear, and the bare oak tree stood above them, and the stream ran over its stones, and the world was entirely quiet. "Edmund," she said. "Yes." he said. You have been very careful, she said. Yes, he said. For a very long time. Yes, he said again. And there was something in his voice now that was not his habitual steadiness, but something underneath it. Something that had been waiting as long as she had. She looked at him steadily. You made a promise when you were 8 years old, she said. I made the same one. I have been carrying it since then, and I will not pretend I have not. And I would not trade a single year of it. Not the waiting, not the letters, not the afternoons at this tree. Not 1 year, Edmund. Because all of it is what brought us here, and I would not arrive here by any other road. He was looking at her with the expression she had named at last. It was the face of a man who loves someone and has respected that love by not rushing it, not demanding it become something before it was ready. It was the most Edmund Harrow thing about him, and she found it, standing in the cold November morning, close to unbearable in its rightness. Then you, he began. Yes, she said. Whatever question you are about to ask. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. The stream moved. A crow crossed the sky above them in a long, unhurried line. The oak tree stood as it had always stood, patient, enormous, entirely itself. I haven't asked yet, he said. I know, she said, but you were going to. You can't simply answer before the question, he said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite the smile, but was adjacent to it, in a way that she found she recognized, and had always recognized. I have known you since you were 8 years old, she said. I know what you are about to say. He looked at her. Then, quietly, in the voice he used for things that cost him effort, and that he meant completely, he said, Will you marry me, Eleanor? She looked back at him. The November morning was very cold and very still. The old oak tree was above them, and the stream was beside them, and 15 years of letters, and afternoons, and silences, and true things, set across dinner tables, and a single grass ring, woven beside a stream, were all, somehow, gathered in this one moment. I told you when I was 8 years old, she said. I accept. The news moved through the county, with the quiet efficiency of news, that people have been expecting, without knowing they were expecting it. There was no single announcement, no formal notice in the paper. There was simply the gradual awareness, spreading from neighbor to neighbor and letter to letter, that the Duke of Dunmore and Lady Eleanor Ashford of the adjacent estate were engaged, and that this had happened in what everyone agreed was the most natural way possible. Mrs. Dalton, their nearest neighbor, said that she had always known. She said this with such conviction that no one thought to question it, and there was, Eleanor reflected privately, some justice to the claim. Mrs. Dalton was an observant woman and had been watching the oak tree for years. Eleanor's mother received the news with the expression of someone who has been waiting for a relief that has been a long time coming. She pressed Eleanor's hand and said nothing for a moment, and then said, I am so glad, my love, in a tone that was simple and complete, and exactly right. Eleanor's father shook Edmund's hand and spoke to him for 40 minutes in the study, with the door closed, the substance of which Eleanor was not told, and which she did not ask about, because some conversations between men and fathers are best left as private. George wrote a letter from London that was, for once, without any of his usual self-satisfaction. He said only, I am very glad for you. I always liked Harrow, even when we were children, and I was too old to admit it. Eleanor read this twice, and then put it in her desk drawer, with the letters she kept. Edmund's side of it was managed with the quiet efficiency of a man who handles all his important business the same way, without fuss, with complete attention, and with a meticulous regard for getting the details right. He wrote to the relevant people. He arranged the necessary legalities with his solicitor. He came to Ashford House for dinner twice in the week following the engagement, sitting across from Eleanor at the family table, in a way that was entirely new and entirely natural at the same time. The way things feel, when they have always been coming, but you are only now allowing yourself to see them. The practical business of the engagement settled itself around them, while they went on being, as they had always been, exactly themselves. They continued to meet at the oak tree. The meetings had not changed in their essential quality. The books, the silences, the conversations that covered serious ground, without ever feeling effortful. But something had opened in them that had not been there before. Not a new warmth exactly. The warmth had always been there, underneath the precision, and the quiet, and the mutual composure. But it was more present now, less held at a distance. Edmund told her more about the estate than he had before, the specific plans for the remaining debt, the decisions about which properties to maintain and which to let, the long-term vision he had for Dunmore Hall, that his father's failures had delayed by 15 years, but had not destroyed. She listened to all of it with the attentiveness she brought to things she took seriously, and offered observations when she had them, and asked questions that cut to the center of whatever he was explaining, in the way that her questions always did. He listened to her in turn. This was not something she took for granted. She had spent enough time in the company of men who listened to women the way they listened to the weather, acknowledging the existence of information without engaging with it, to know that Edmund's quality of attention was not common. When she said something he found incorrect, he said so, clearly and without condescension. When she said something he had not considered, he told her that too, with the straightforward acknowledgement of a person who has no investment in being the one who knows everything. She thought, sometimes, that this was the thing she valued most in him. Not the steadiness, not the reliability, not even the long faithfulness of the promise. All of those were real, and all of them mattered. But this, the fact that in 30 years of knowing him, he had never once made her feel that her mind was a problem to be managed, rather than a thing to be engaged with. This was the thing that went deepest. December arrived, and with it, the social calendar that London imposed on everyone, regardless of their preferences. There were engagements to be honored, and calls to be made, and the ordinary machinery of society to be navigated. Eleanor and Edmund navigated it together for the first time, which meant the ordinary machinery of society received them at dinner tables and assemblies as an engaged pair, which produced a certain quality of attention that Eleanor found mildly tedious, and Edmund appeared to find entirely irrelevant. At a dinner in the third week of November, a woman of about 40, named Lady Barlow, who was pleasant enough, and was simply the person at the table most interested in the subject, asked Eleanor how the engagement had come about. It was the question she had been asked 11 times in the previous 2 weeks, in various forms, and she had given 11 variations of the same vague, gracious answer. She gave Lady Barlow the 12th version, and then, for the first time, looked across the table to find Edmund watching her from the other end, with an expression that she recognized as the suppressed something expression, the one he produced when there was something he was not saying and was deciding whether to say it. She raised an eyebrow very slightly. He raised one in return. Lady Barlow, looking between them, said, "Oh," in the tone of someone witnessing something they find charming, without understanding precisely what it is. After dinner, when the company had moved into the drawing room and the evening had reached its comfortable middle section, Edmund appeared beside her. "You could tell the truth," he said quietly. "To Lady Barlow?" Eleanor said. "To anyone who asks," he said. "There is nothing in the true version of events that requires concealment." She considered this. "The true version," she said, "is that you proposed marriage when you were 8 years old, with a ring woven from grass, and I accepted, and we have both meant it ever since." "Yes," he said. "And you think Lady Barlow is prepared for that information?" "I think," he said, with the small movement of his expression that was the closest he consistently came to amusement, "that you generally underestimate how much people can manage when told things directly." She looked at him for a moment. "You," she said, "are the least demonstrative person I have ever known, and you want me to tell dinner-party acquaintances the story of a grass ring, only if asked," he said. She made a sound that was very nearly a laugh, a real one, not the polite variety she had been producing all evening. It surprised her slightly. It surprised him too, she thought, in a pleasant way. "Perhaps," she said, "I will tell the Countess first, as a rehearsal." "The Countess already knows," he said. "She arranged the seating plan. She told me so herself when I thanked her." Eleanor looked across the room to where the Countess was holding court in her usual armchair, brilliant and serene. "She told you she arranged the seating plan," she said, "and I am giving you her exact words. You have been waiting to sit beside that girl for 20 years. Dunmore, I simply gave you the opportunity." Eleanor looked at the Countess for a long moment. The Countess, sensing attention, looked across the room and met her gaze with an expression of absolute satisfaction. Eleanor inclined her head very slightly. The Countess inclined hers in return. "I owe her a very nice gift," Eleanor said. "I have already sent one," Edmund said. Of course you have, Eleanor said. They stood for a moment in the comfortable noise of the drawing room, close enough to be a pair without needing to perform it, and Eleanor thought that this was what she had always understood it would be like if they ever arrived here. Not a transformation, not a dramatic change, but simply the feeling of being completely in the right place. She went to the oak tree on the last day of November, alone, in the early morning before the house was fully awake. November had done what November does and left the landscape stripped and honest. The tree stood in the frost-silver morning looking ancient and permanent, which was simply what it was. She stood at the base of it. She put her hand flat against the bark, as she had done, on and off, since she was 5 years old. The bark was cold and rough and absolute under her palm. She thought about a 7-year-old girl pressing a bleeding hand into a cold stream. She thought about a boy tearing the hem of his shirt to bind the cut. She thought about a grass ring and a handshake and the clear, uncomplicated way that children mean things before the world teaches them to qualify and hedge and hold back. She thought about how many times she had come to this tree and sat with the feeling she was now standing here to acknowledge. She thought about how many times she had looked at the distance between herself and the thing she wanted and chose not to measure it, because measuring it would have made it feel larger than it was. She had been right not to measure it. The distance, it turned out, was exactly crossable. It had always been exactly crossable. It had simply needed the right amount of time. She stayed for a few minutes in the cold morning, just standing there, feeling the bark of the tree under her hand and the frost in the air, and the particular quality of a life that has arrived at a point it has been heading toward for a long time. Then she went back to the house, because it was cold, and breakfast would be ready, and Edmund was coming for dinner, and her mother needed help with the seating plan, and life, which had always been good even in its waiting, was very good now in its arriving. The formal engagement was announced in January, printed in the newspaper with the plain, precise language that such announcements use, and London received it with the collective feeling of something recognized rather than discovered. People who had watched both of them at parties over the years said they had always sensed it. People who had never met either of them had opinions anyway, because they always do. The betting books at one of the gentlemen's clubs updated their ledgers in a way that produced considerable satisfaction for the gentlemen who had placed their wagers on the correct outcome some years previously. Eleanor paid very little attention to any of this. She was engaged to Edmund Harrow, Duke of Dunmore, in the particular and private way that she had been in some sense engaged to him since she was 8 years old, and the public version of the arrangement was, in the truest sense, a secondary matter. What was not secondary was the business of becoming fully acquainted with the life she was going to enter. Dunmore Hall was, she found on her first proper visit, accompanied by her mother, for propriety's sake, and conducted with the thoroughness of a woman who takes the management of a household seriously. A beautiful house, with a complicated past, and a great deal of potential. It was older than Ashford House, built in a different century, with a different architectural logic, full of large rooms and high ceilings, and windows that faced north in ways that made sense historically, and produced considerable cold in winter. The north wing needed more than replastering, as it turned out, but Edmund had already known this, and had simply used the most pressing item as his representative example. She walked through the house with Edmund and his housekeeper, a formidable woman named Mrs. Oakes, who had been at Dunmore Hall for 30 years, and had managed it, through the worst years of the late Earl's tenure, and the long, careful reconstruction that followed, with the ferocious competence of someone who loves a place, and will not let it fall apart on their watch. Mrs. Oakes greeted Eleanor with the careful assessment of a person who needs to determine whether this new arrival deserves the house she is being given responsibility for. Eleanor assessed Mrs. Oakes in return with equal care. By the end of the afternoon they had reached, without any particular ceremony, a mutual understanding. Eleanor knew her way around a household. She was not going to interfere with what was working. She was going to care about the house. Mrs. Oakes could see all three of these things and found them acceptable. Edmund, watching this exchange from the slight distance of a man who understands that some things are best left to manage themselves, said nothing, and looked moderately relieved. The wedding was set for April. It was not a grand wedding, because neither of them wanted a grand wedding, and they had, by this point in their lives, enough combined composure to say so plainly to the people who might have wanted otherwise. It was a proper wedding, The right church, the right guests, the right arrangements, conducted with care and without excess, exactly like everything else Edmund had managed for the previous 12 years. In the weeks leading up to April, Eleanor found that she was not nervous, which she had wondered about. She had heard from other women that the approach to a wedding produced a particular kind of anxiety, an awareness of irreversibility, a sudden sharp consciousness of what was being committed to. She examined herself carefully, and found that what she felt was not anxiety, but something much quieter, a readiness, the feeling of a door opening that she had been standing beside, waiting, for a very long time. She told Edmund this, on a cold February afternoon at the oak tree, because she told him things that were true, rather than things that were expected. He looked at her. He said, "I have been ready for a considerable number of years." She said, "I know." They sat for a while in the winter quiet, and the stream moved, and the oak tree stood above them with its familiar and enormous patience, and Eleanor felt that the world was in very good order. She went home and wrote a letter to George, telling him the date and asking him to be present, which he said he would be, and also that he had recently begun reading a history of the Byzantine Empire, and found it very good, which meant Edmund's influence was spreading in unexpected directions. She wrote to the Countess of Whitmore, a carefully worded note that expressed genuine gratitude in the compressed and dignified way that genuine gratitude sometimes requires. She helped her mother plan what she would wear, and then she helped Mrs. Oakes plan the arrangements at Dunmore Hall for the reception that would follow the ceremony. And she found that these practical tasks, which another person might have found tedious, were satisfying in the particular way of things that are done for reasons that matter. March arrived. The grounds of both estates were beginning to show the first hesitant signs of spring. A crocus here, a snowdrop there. The kind of signs that would have no meaning in any other year, and that in this particular year felt, to Eleanor's private amusement, somewhat personally directed. She walked the estate boundary one morning in mid-March, the path she had walked since childhood, and stopped at the oak tree on her way back. The first leaves were coming, tiny and pale and tentative. The tree was beginning to be what it was in summer, returning from the stripped clarity of winter to the full, rich presence of a warm season oak. She stood and looked at it for a long time. She thought about everything it had witnessed: 2 children in the summer of 1803, a handshake, a grass ring, a departure, a return, years of quiet afternoons, and letters read aloud in the imagination to someone far away. She thought about the way some things persist, not because they are dramatic, but simply because they are true, because they are made of the right material and built to last. She put her hand against the bark. The bark was warming now with the March sun, no longer the deep cold of February. She stood there for a moment, with the warming bark under her palm, and the first small leaves above her, and the whole spring turning quietly in the world around her. "Thank you," she said, to the tree, which was not something she generally did, but the oak tree had been a patient witness to 15 years of her most private life, and she felt it was owed the acknowledgement. The tree said nothing. Trees, in her experience, were best at this. She went home. Edmund was expected for dinner. April was 3 weeks away. The oak tree was putting out its leaves, and the stream was running bright with snowmelt. And somewhere in the distance, a wood pigeon was doing whatever wood pigeons do in March, full of business and entirely pleased with itself. Eleanor Ashford walked back to Ashford House in the March morning, and felt, precisely and completely, and without any reservation at all, that her life was exactly right. The morning of the wedding arrived with the composed benevolence of a day that has decided to cooperate. April in England could not always be trusted to produce decent weather, but it produced decent weather on this particular Saturday. Pale blue sky, light clouds, a slight wind that was not cold, birdsong from the hedges. Eleanor stood at her bedroom window at 7 in the morning, and noted all of this with the matter-of-fact satisfaction of someone who has planned carefully and deserves a cooperative day. She dressed with the help of her maid Nell, who had an expression she had been wearing for 3 days, a mixture of sentiment and barely contained emotion, that Eleanor found both touching and faintly alarming. Nell was not a person who normally showed a great deal of feeling. That she was showing it now said something Eleanor chose to take in the spirit in which it was offered. "Nell," Eleanor said, while Nell was doing something careful to the back of her hair. "Yes, my lady," Nell said, in a slightly thicker voice than usual. "Please do not cry on my dress," Eleanor said. "It is very nice, and I would prefer it to remain dry." Nell made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something else, and collected herself admirably. "I'm quite all right," she said, in a tone that meant she was not quite all right, but was managing it. Eleanor looked at herself in the mirror. The dress was ivory, simply cut, with no excess ornamentation, which was exactly as she had wanted. Her mother's pearls at her throat, her own good sense everywhere else. She looked, she thought with clear-eyed assessment, like herself, which was exactly right. Her mother came in at 8:30. She stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at Eleanor, in the way that mothers look at their children, at moments they know will remain with them always, very still, very present, with a quality of attention that goes beyond the ordinary. Then she came across the room, and kissed Eleanor's cheek, and said, "My love," and nothing else, because some things are not improved by elaboration. Eleanor's father was waiting at the bottom of the stairs. He was wearing his best coat, and had the look of a man who had been composing himself for several days, and was mostly succeeding. He gave Eleanor his arm and said, "Shall we go then?" which was a short sentence for a long moment, but he had always been a man who packed a great deal into small containers. The church was a 10-minute carriage ride. The morning continued to cooperate. Eleanor sat in the carriage with her father and looked out the window at the April countryside and thought about nothing at all, which was a remarkable achievement, and one she intended to sustain. The church was full. The Countess of Whitmore was in the second row, on Edmund's side of the aisle, looking magnificent. Henry Clifton was present, as Edmund's oldest friend, with the expression of a man who finds the occasion entirely worthy of the day. George was somewhere toward the back. Eleanor could not see where, but she had heard his voice in the churchyard outside, and that was sufficient. She walked up the aisle on her father's arm, with the steadiness that was simply her. She did not look at the congregation. She looked straight ahead. Edmund was at the front of the church. He had his back to her, which was proper, and he turned when she reached the appropriate point in the proceedings, and she saw his face. And it was the face she had known all her life, and it was the same as it had always been. The dark eyes, the precision, the steadiness. But he looked at her now, with the expression she had named at last, openly and without reserve, and she thought it was perhaps the most honest thing she had ever seen. The ceremony was the ceremony. She said what she was supposed to say, clearly and without hesitation, because she had never said anything she did not mean, and she was not about to start now. He said what he was supposed to say, with the particular careful sincerity that she had heard him apply to everything that mattered to him, and the words in his voice sounded less like a formality, and more like the completion of something that had been in progress for a very long time. When the ring was on her finger, gold, simple, exactly right, she thought briefly of a ring woven from long grass, placed on the finger of a 7-year-old girl at the base of an oak tree, and something inside her settled with a finality that felt like the last line of a very long and very good book. The reception at Dunmore Hall was everything an estate party should be in April, with good food and good wine, and a quality of warmth that came not from the effort of being festive, but from the genuine pleasure of people who are glad to be gathered for a real reason. Mrs. Oakes had managed the arrangements with her customary ferocious competence. The north wing was, very sensibly, kept closed. The Countess found Eleanor early in the afternoon, and said with no preamble at all, "I have been waiting for this for 3 years. You took longer than I expected." "I was not aware," Eleanor said, "that you had a timeline." "I have timelines for everything," the Countess said pleasantly. "Yours was generous. You used it all." Eleanor looked at her with genuine warmth, which the Countess received with genuine pleasure. "Thank you," Eleanor said, "for the seating plan." The Countess waved a gracious hand. "I simply put 2 people beside each other. You did the rest yourselves." "We had had considerable practice," Eleanor said. Henry Clifton toasted the couple at dinner with a speech that was warm and precise and not too long, which was exactly what a toast should be, and said, among other things, that he had known Edmund Harrow for 15 years, and had come to understand that he was a man who moved slowly toward the things that mattered, and absolutely toward them, and that Lady Eleanor was, in his observation, the thing that had mattered longest of all. There was applause. Edmund looked at his plate with the expression of a man who is moved, and is managing it, through excellent posture. Eleanor looked at Henry Clifton, and nodded, because the speech deserved acknowledgement. George said, in the private moment he found at the edge of the garden before the evening was fully done. I'm glad it's him, El. Using the old childhood abbreviation that he had not used in years, with the simplicity of a brother who has run out of all other ways to say something. I always thought it would be him, even when we were children, even when it seemed completely impractical. Nothing, Eleanor said, that is built correctly is impractical. George looked at her for a moment and then hugged her, briefly and slightly awkwardly, the way brothers hug sisters who are not demonstrative, and then stepped back and cleared his throat and went back toward the lighted windows of the house. The evening ended gradually, the way good evenings do, with guests departing in ones and twos, while the light went soft and the April darkness settled over the grounds of Dunmore Hall. Eleanor stood at the drawing-room window at some point in the late evening and looked out at the dark garden and thought that she could just see, in the direction of the estate boundary, the very faint outline of the oak tree against the sky. Edmund came to stand beside her. They stood together at the window, in the comfortable quiet that had always been comfortable, that had been one of the first things she had understood about him when she was a child. That silence between them was never empty, never awkward, but simply the space in which real things lived. The north wing, she said after a moment. The north wing, he agreed. Spring is the right time to start. I know. He was looking at the dark garden too. I have a mason coming on Thursday. Good, she said. The last guests departed. Nell had been seen to quarters. The house was quiet. Edmund's household moved through its final routines of the evening, and the lights in the hall went down, and the house settled into its nighttime self. Later, in the quiet of Dunmore Hall with the April night outside the windows and the great house around them beginning, slowly, to feel like theirs, Edmund said something he had been turning over in the careful way he turned things over, examining it from all sides before deciding it was worth saying. He said, I never doubted you would wait. She looked at him. You could not have known that. No, he said, I simply... He stopped. He looked for the right word, the one that meant what he intended. I knew you, he said. I have known you since you were 7 years old, and you pressed your bleeding hand into a cold stream and did not cry. I knew what kind of person you were. I always knew. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I knew you too. Yes, he said. I knew you would come back, she said, when you left for Edinburgh. I knew it, the way you know things that are simply true. He looked at her with the expression that she had named at last, and would never need to puzzle over again. I did come back, he said. You did, she said. You kept both promises. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, very quietly, you kept yours too. She had. She had kept it in the way she kept everything, steadily, without drama, without requiring the world to acknowledge it. She had kept it across 15 years of waiting, and letters, and afternoons, at a tree, and dinners in London, and one evening at a country house party, when she had said a true thing to the right person, at exactly the right moment. She had said it, and he had heard it, and here they were. The April night was quiet outside the windows of Dunmore Hall. The grounds were dark, and the oak tree stood at the border of 2 estates in the darkness, enormous and patient, keeping its long silence. In the morning, Eleanor went to visit it. She went alone, through the damp April grass in the early light, across the field and through the gate. The gate with the fixed latch, fixed 3 weeks ago on Edmund's instructions, because she had mentioned once, in passing, that it had been difficult, and across the border of the 2 estates, to where the great tree stood. The tree was fully in leaf now. April had done its work. The branches were green and full, and moving slightly in the early morning breeze, and the stream ran bright at the tree's roots, and the light came through the leaves in pieces, the way summer light does when the wind is moving. She stood at the base of the tree. She looked up through the canopy at the morning sky between the leaves. She thought about a 7-year-old girl and an 8-year-old boy. She thought about a grass ring and a handshake. She thought about 15 years of a promise kept in the quietest, most persistent, most honest way she knew how. She put her hand flat against the bark. The bark was warm now in the April morning sun. She stood there for a long time, not saying anything, just being present with all of it, the tree, the stream, the leaves, the morning, the life she was standing at the threshold of. Then she heard footsteps on the grass behind her. She turned, and Edmund was there, coming across the field in the morning light, his coat not quite properly fastened, because he had come directly from the house, and had not, apparently, taken the extra minute. He stopped when he saw her. He looked at her under the oak tree in the April morning, with the expression she would see on his face for the rest of her life, and never tire of seeing. "I thought you might be here," he said. "I usually am," she said. He crossed the grass and stood beside her, and they both looked up through the green canopy at the April sky, and the stream moved over its stones, and the morning birds were doing their business in the hedgerows, and the oak tree stood above them both, as it had always stood, enormous and patient, and entirely indifferent, and entirely constant. "Shall we go back?" he said, after a while. "In a moment," she said. They stood a moment longer. The morning light moved in the leaves. The stream ran clear and cold over its stones. "Two promises," she said quietly, looking up through the green. "Both kept," he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. Between them, in the spring morning under the old tree, was everything that had been said, and everything that had not needed to be said, all the years of it, all the honesty of it, all the patient and undemanding faith of it. "Yes," she said. And they went home.